top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. 12,000, no, I'm not making it up, 12,000 Albanians that cross the English Channel have jumped their bail terms. They're missing out there somewhere in the country as more and more of them get found and get arrested for serious crimes. What should be done? Plus, Dan Wootton joins me again this evening to talk about the second part of the exclusive interview with Eamon Holmes, where he reveals why Philip Schofield came out as gay. That and much more in just a moment, but first, let's get the news with Bethany Elsey.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. Downing Street has denied claims of a cover-up over the release of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages to the COVID inquiry. The inquiry has now extended the deadline for the government to hand over the unredacted messages to Thursday. The Cabinet Office previously argued the material was irrelevant. The Prime Minister has defended the government's approach, insisting they are cooperating. But Shadow Chancellor Wes Streeting says he's withholding information.
He says he wants the government to cooperate with the inquiry, but the government has been withholding information the inquiry's asked for. 1 minute the government says that the messages they have are immaterial. The next minute they're saying they don't exist. Well, which is it? And I'm afraid the Prime Minister's slipperiness today has given all the impression of someone who isn't fully committed to transparency, openness, accountability.
It's reported ITV bosses are to be grilled by MPs in Parliament next week over their handling of Philip Schofield's affair with a younger male colleague. Schofield quit ITV and was dropped by his agency after admitting to the affair. The scandal has brought accusations of a cover-up, but the broadcaster insists it did investigate at the time. Former This Morning staff, including presenter Eamon Holmes, has also alleged there was a toxic culture on the programme. A feminist professor has had her talk at Oxford University interrupted by trans rights protesters. Earlier, the Prime Minister defended Kathleen Stock's right to give the speech, saying that debate is a hallmark of a tolerant society. But the university's LGBTQ+ society says they're standing up for trans rights. Protesters waved rainbow flags, and one, who wore a T-shirt saying "No more dead trans kids," glued herself to the floor. Outside the hall, activist Chrissy told GB News trans people are treated differently.
You listen to that phrase itself, a debate about trans existence, trans rights. If we were to talk about black people and debate your existence? How would you feel if, people frame it as the transgender issue, the transgender debate, the trans question? As I say, if we were to ask that of black people or Jewish people, there would be outrage.
Russia's president has blamed Ukraine for a rare drone strike on Moscow, labelling it as a terrorist activity. The Kremlin claims it shot down all 8 drones, which targeted civilian infrastructure. Several buildings were damaged and at least 2 people were injured. Meanwhile, Ukraine has denied responsibility for the attack in Moscow, and its military claims to have intercepted more than 20 Russian drones in the latest wave of strikes on its capital, Kyiv. It's the 3rd time Russia's struck Kyiv in the past 24 hours. 1 person was killed in the capital and 4 others killed across Ukraine. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Nigel.
Good evening. Well, don't say that I didn't warn you, because it began in June and July last year. As the number of small boats crossing the English Channel increased, we noticed something different about those in the boats. Yes, they were starting to come in ever-increasing numbers from Albania. Yes, Albania. Albania, a country which is a holiday destination for many, many British people, a country that is an applicant member even of the European Union, and from which absolutely nobody should ever be able to claim refugee status. And yet the numbers came and they kept on coming, and the government did precious little. And it was so obvious from all the adverts on TikTok that these young men were coming. Not every single one, but most of these young men were coming for one very simple reason: to work in the illegal crime economy in this country. Well, we learn today that in the first 4 months of this year, 80 Albanians that have come via that route have been convicted in court of crimes, some of them very serious. I'm talking murder, I'm talking rape, I'm talking abduction, and of course, in the vast majority of cases, running illegal cannabis farms. Well, if that wasn't bad enough, just have a think about this. 4 years ago, Albanians were the 16th highest category of foreign prisoner in British prisons. They're now the number 1. And perhaps that's no surprise to you. But the biggest shock of all is that 12,000 Albanians who crossed the English Channel have now broken their bail terms. They've cut off their tags or whatever it may be and simply disappeared and gone off, in many, many cases, into criminal activities. Now, look, when I was warning about this last summer, I was called all the names under the sun. How dare I pick out a specific group of people and apply a tag like criminal to them? But it was obvious to me we were simply allowing criminals to cross the Channel. What annoyed me about it was not only did they not qualify for refugee status, but that the first duty of government is to defend the country and to make sure its people are safe, which clearly isn't happening with these Albanian gangs. The government in the end did take some action, and 1,000 or so Albanians have been deported back to the country. But what about the 12,000 that have simply gone missing? And what about if more start to come in the next few months when the weather improves? I think the whole situation is frankly appalling. It shows total gutlessness from our government. And my question to you is, what should be done? Give me your thoughts, give me your views. Farage@gbnews.com. As far as I'm concerned, anyone that comes across the Channel or in the back of a lorry from Albania should be deported back to Tirana within 24 hours. And if you do that, you know something? They will stop coming. Well, joining me to discuss, I think, this very deeply concerning situation is Chris Phillips, former head of National Counter-Terrorism Security Office and Detective Chief Inspector, of course, of the Met in those days. Chris, you're now in the field of international consultancy, but speaking with a sort of copper's hat on for a moment, wasn't it obvious what was happening last year?
Yeah, it very much was, Nigel. And the difficulty with this subject, of course, is you get called all sorts of names, as you have been, for simply speaking the obvious truth. Now, many of these people are coming over not only to find a life in the UK, but specifically to commit crime. And they're being brought over by the crime gangs in order to do that. And in particular, drug dealing and drug manufacture, etc., in the UK. But this is a major problem, and I think what the people of the UK don't really understand is that this criminality is such big business. It's a corporation. Some of these businesses that the mafia networks that are doing this are huge and all-encompassing, and will deal with any form of crime that they think they can make some money out of.
Yes, I mean the illegal drugs trade is. We're talking, a dark economy of billions and billions of pounds a year. Now, some say, but be careful. A lot of these young men are being trafficked so they can claim the Modern Slavery Act to stop them being deported. But, I mean, it's difficult to see evidence of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think they're being trafficked as much as some of them will pay take a loan out effectively from these organisations, which will then be held over them if they don't work for them, for these organisations within the UK.
And that would be the $3,500 across the channel.
Yeah, exactly. So they'll be given the $3,500 to get across the channel. Then they've got to work for these groups when they're in the UK. And of course, the violence that goes along with this. We've seen with the figures that have been muted today. That's the tip of the iceberg. This will be going on undercover. There'll be some people working in the grey economy, in the car washes that we've seen across the country. But some of this is really hardcore, violent crime.
Mark White, our Home Affairs and Security Editor, was up in East Anglia the other day, and the East Anglian police were saying to him, we've seen a complete change in the last 3 to 4 years. Suddenly, the Albanians are running all the criminal activities. They've edged out perhaps other gangs that were there previously, and they're a lot more violent and a lot more dangerous. Chris, what I'm told is that the Albanian crime wave is being felt right across the country.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's also across the world. This is not just the UK's issue, but it's a big issue for us. But yes, it's not being pushed into London. This is something that's being pushed out, and I believe sort of Kent area is one of the main areas for them to get that they've got a foothold.
It's extraordinary. On a broader issue, we know that with those atrocities that were committed in Paris, those 7 or 8 years ago, of the 8 men that did it, 5 of the 8 had crossed the Mediterranean. We know that huge numbers that cross the English Channel, the majority, throw away their passports, throw away their iPhones. From a counter-terrorism perspective, we do, of course, fingerprint people that cross, so we are able to weed out some potential terrorists.
Yes. Well, when we say weed them out, what are we doing with them? We're not sending them back. We're keeping them in the UK and trying to turn them, if you like. In reality, they're being released into the communities, and at some stage in the future, they'll go bad, no doubt, some of them. And with regard to terrorism, it's such a heinous crime that one incident, as we saw in Manchester, is so all-consuming. And we're not talking about, someone being robbed here. We're talking about people being murdered on a very large scale. So we are really playing Russian roulette with our people. And unless the government, of whatever form it is, does something about this to deal with the nature of this different sort of crime than we're actually used to, then we're going to have problems in the future.
So let's be clear. Tens of thousands of young, unidentified young males coming across the channel via traffickers every year into our country is a potential threat to national security.
Oh, most definitely it is, yes. And it's from a terrorism perspective, but also from a crime, because these crimes actually has such an impact. The horrendous heroin addictions that we see in our cities, the cocaine addictions, even the cannabis farms that are popping up all over the country. Yeah. Big issues for local communities. And, of course, communities aren't set up to deal with it.
Yeah, because crime is not just a statistic. Crime is innocent folk suffering, neighbourhoods being devalued, people, being victims of all sorts of, whether it's mugging or break-ins or whatever it is. Crime affects real people, affects people's lives. How worried do you think the police forces around the country are about this?
I think the police forces would be very, very concerned. If you speak to them quietly, they won't announce that. They won't announce that to the public because they know the issues that are happening on their turf, generally. They don't really have even the resources at the moment to deal with what they've got. And, of course, the level of violence that we see, particularly with the Albanian mafia-type crimes, is so high that they won't have the resources whatsoever to deal with them. And this is stuff that not only permeates across the UK, but these same groups will be linked with Colombia, they'll be even linked in China and all sorts of places, bringing in all sorts of other crimes. And, of course, the prostitution issue as well is a huge problem, and that's, again, linked very much to the Albanian mafia gangs.
And we noticed last summer, for the first time, young, single, teenage girls crossing in some of the boats. We'd never seen this before, not since this really began in 2019, and it didn't take much working out to think where some of these young women may well end up. Well, Chris, you know, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure the police are quietly concerned, but will never say a word in public. Our politicians talk endlessly around this subject, don't seem to find any solutions. And the situation just seems to get worse. If you were in charge, Chris Phillips, what would you do?
Well, first things first, it's the people that really suffer from this are the people that live in our inner cities and in the communities. You know, the people that live in Islington and other locations don't have the...
What you mean where our leaders live?
Yeah, they don't suffer the problems that people are... You know, I've worked in Clapham, Brixton, all these places. They are the ones that are suffering from this group of people that are coming in, you know, over the last 10 years, probably. But we do have to have a more nationalised police force. I think the NCA is there. It works, but it needs to be boosted up because the type of crime that we're going to be dealing with does need a more FBI-type policing system to deal with that. And local police forces really aren't set up to be able to deal with those.
OK, Chris Phillips, as ever, thank you for coming in and joining me here on GB News. And I'm sorry if that story is a bit depressing, and I'm sorry if you think I'm saying I told you so, but I jolly well did. And I think this is serious, and this is impacting the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people around our country. It is a complete and absolute disgrace and makes me very, very angry, though I do try to hide it. In a moment, I'll be joined by Dan Wootton. He will, tonight, show the second part of his exclusive interview with Eamon Holmes, in which Eamon tells us why, and he was part of it, tells us why Philip Schofield came out as gay. It was, of course, because the story was about to break in the national press. This reveals the sheer cynicism of ITV, the national press, Schofield himself, and why Eamon Holmes feels he was taken for a complete fool. All of that in a couple of minutes.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News.
Well, some of your reactions to this Albanian crime disaster, because that is what I'm going to call it from now on. Ryan says we should stop allowing Albanians to enter the country via small boats. Once in the country, they are almost impossible to get rid of thanks to the ECHR. Yes, the ECHR and whatever barriers run. As I say, the only way you stop this is you make sure every single one of them is on a plane back to Tirana within 24 hours. Another viewer says, don't give them any benefits. Well, actually, what they're getting is 3 square meals a day, a 4-star hotel, free dental care, free medical care, and 38 quid a week cigarette money. One viewer says, Albania is a safe country. Every person who arrives into the UK through an illegal method should be deported within 24 hours. No exemptions. I agree entirely. Now, last night, it was the Dan Wootton interview with Eamon Holmes that was absolutely dominating all of the news websites and much of our newspaper coverage this morning. Well, it's part 2 tonight of that exclusive interview, which Dan Wootton is going to be showing from 9 o'clock here on GB News. But here is just a little snippet of what's to come later.
I began to feel there was a certain line being pattered here. I just decided at this point, not sure. I'm just beginning to feel bad vibes about this. I think I'm not saying anything. So I don't say anything in the opener. Ruth says what she has to say. Then it goes to those two in their choreographed way. Knowing how false they are, I'm sure they've rehearsed it for days.
So this has been planned for some time?
It's been planned for some time. And it then materialises, obviously all is not what it seems. Because he has obviously done a deal with the newspaper to give a version of what the newspaper knew. And it was all a bit weird.
Dan Wootton joins me again. Dan, that was Eamon Holmes exposing the cynicism with which This Morning as a programme dealt with this, with which ITV allowed them to behave that way, the way in which the Sun newspaper worked with the programme. And again, it's one of those things, you know, I knew exactly why he'd come out as gay, but this will be a shock to the people. So just explain exactly what happened here.
Indeed, because this is a key part of the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there is this event, the National Television Awards, where there is some sort of incident. This is in January 2020, where this young runner confronts Philip, confronts Holly, confronts a number of ITV executives.
In front of all the media.
In front of all of the media, including me. Yep. Saw it with my own eyes that night, Nigel. And so clearly, ITV bosses knew there was a big problem. There needed to be some serious damage control. And within just a week, you've got Schofield on the sofa coming out. Now, what Eamon reveals tonight is his absolute fury at being part of this sham. He says he was lied to. Him and Ruth were not told about what was going on until just a couple of hours beforehand.
And what was going on was the Sun was about to run a massive expose about the relationship with this young boy.
Not exactly. What had happened is that I, by that point, had moved into a different role at The Sun, and a decision had been made for the newspaper to have a closer relationship with ITV, and as part of that closer relationship, they were offered ringside seats and an exclusive interview for this coming up announcement. As a result, obviously they wouldn't run a story about the young runner, but it was actually something that was prompted by Philip. He's a crafty guy. You know, he thought, I need to get the biggest tabloid newspaper in the country on my side if they're going to swallow this story. But what was particularly shocking, I think, for Eamon in all of this is that he was used.
Yes.
And he feels used, and he says now, because he's been hit all the time, him and Ruth have been hit all the time with these pictures of him hugging Philip and seemingly supporting Philip, and he says he feels embarrassed and ashamed when he sees
because
those
it was
photos.
pre-planned, it was cynical, and it was done for a reason.
Of course, and there's an amazing part of the interview, Nigel, which we'll show later in my show tonight, where he says that Philip was acting that whole day, and he says he walks into his dressing room first thing in the morning, throws himself onto his knees in front of Eamon and starts sobbing, saying, I'm gay. And Eamon says, who cares? Move on, mate. But look, it just shows, I think, that what we often see on that sofa, we're increasingly learning, is not the reality, and that's what's going to shock the public so much. Lots of breaking developments on this story tonight.
Aren't there just? So we're now seeing a story that says Schofield's lover was paid off by ITV after Shane Starr's affair ended. What do we know about that?
Well, indeed, and ITV are currently stonewalling the Daily Mail on that. They're just hiding behind the statement that they sent on Saturday. That's not going to hold because, remember, there's an ITV executive who's going to have to go in front of the Select Committee on Tuesday and face MPs. So you can't just say, we're not answering this question. So there's a big scandal brewing about who knew about this payoff? How much did he receive? Was any money coming directly from Philip, or did it all come from ITV? And then you've got this very woke chief executive, Carolyn McCall, who is holier than thou. You know, if you're Piers Morgan questioning Meghan, or you're Carol McGiffin questioning the COVID vaccines, you're booted off that channel immediately. Now, today, I've actually obtained an email which was sent to Carolyn McCall by a former This Morning staff member in February 2020, revealing all of the details about this relationship with the young runner, including a link to a whole load of pictures showing Philip and this young man together. ITV today refused to tell me if it was that email that prompted their so-called failed investigation. We know it failed because they swallowed these lies from Philip Schofield.
Well, I wonder who will appear next Tuesday morning before the DCMS committee.
Well, Carolyn McCall, you know, she is the chief executive of a publicly listed company.
Do you think she'll go?
I absolutely don't think she will go, but she should go.
Yeah.
She should go. I mean, this is a woman who has held so many others to account, hasn't given anyone a second chance, and now she believes she can sit in her ivory tower and hide behind a pathetic statement which has been proven to be untrue. I mean, you know, we haven't heard anything from ITV, Nigel, since Saturday. This is the biggest scandal that this broadcaster has faced in a generation.
And as you say, story after story breaking almost still hour by hour. A thought on Holly Willoughby. You know, Eamon was pretty clear that he didn't believe her. I mean, if I knew that this relationship was going on and the coming out as gay thing was a front and a cover, frankly, for it all, if I knew it, Holly Willoughby must have known it.
And this is the difficulty. She is due to return to that sofa on Monday, and now a whole load of pictures have emerged with Holly and this young man. Now, in fairness to Holly, she was the person who started the ball rolling on this. It wasn't ITV who got rid of Philip Schofield from that sofa. It was only Holly Willoughby, because she made it clear to the bosses that she was not going to work with the man anymore. But did she swallow and accept his lie? Was she genuinely misled, or was there a case of willful blindness? Because I think this is becoming very clear now that there was willful blindness from ITV. Now, they're going to blame it on incompetence, aren't they? But Eamon said last night that it is a cover-up.
When you work as closely with a colleague as she did with Philip Schofield, it is impossible, prior to that coming out charade, that she could not have known.
Well, this 16-year-old boy was on the sofa making videos with Holly and Phil. So did he spin her some sort of web of lies about who he was? It is difficult for Holly. I feel for her in some ways, though, Nigel, because this was her worst nightmare. This is exactly what she feared.
And she's a very popular figure.
Yeah, and that's why she tried to break free from him.
Yeah.
And lots of people breaking free from Philip Schofield tonight, though the Prince's trust, the King, has now cut all relationships with Philip Schofield in the past hour. This is quite significant. You'll remember Philip Schofield was the chosen one. He actually got to interview the late Duke of Edinburgh for a big TV special, so he's always been very close to royalty, and obviously his brand now so tainted that King Charles has decided it's simply impossible for him to continue.
Well, you know, you may well think there are other big political issues that matter, but this really is the story that is dominating everything. And I didn't even know what Dan just told me, that the Prince's Trust had now broken away as well. Lots more to come on this, but GB News completely leading the way on this story in, I think, the most astonishing way. Stay with us this evening, stay with Jacob. More to come from Dan Wootton later, and no doubt it'll dominate the newspapers tomorrow. Now, you know, I often talk on this show about Tory incompetence, the way they're mismanaging the economy. But I think the evidence is mounting that Labour would be even worse. In a moment we discuss their completely balmy idea for what our pension funds should do with your money.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
GB.
So, as I say, I've often been critical often been very, very critical of the government on pensions, and in a moment I'm going to tell you just how mad the whole thing is. But this one's really interesting. Sir Patrick Vallance, remember him? He was on our screens almost every day. There he was with Chris Whitty and, of course, with the Prime Minister, or indeed with the man that ran health, Matt Hancock, in those days, and he was the government's chief scientific officer. So a guy, you know, had a really important role throughout the pandemic. But what is really interesting is that he and others, in fact, Dame Bingham, the woman responsible for what was seen to be a very successful vaccine rollout, certainly compared to members of the European Union, both of them are now saying maybe we need to rethink drugs. Now, it's funny, isn't it? Because our first item tonight was about Albanian criminal gangs, about cannabis farms. And if you think about it, drugs play a massive role in our lives, whether it's illegal drugs and the crime that goes with them, or whether it's legal drugs and what we take and what gets given to us on prescription. Now, there's been an absolutely huge increase in this country of the number of people being given antidepressants. Something like 6.5 million people are prescribed with antidepressants. And I'm very struck that many of those people that get these prescriptions and repeat prescriptions that go on year after year never actually get any better. It's as if the pharmaceutical industry makes billions giving us drugs that may, in the short term, make us feel slightly better, but don't make us better. So this absolutely revolutionary idea from Sir Patrick Vallance and others that maybe LSD should be given to us on the National Health Service. Now, I know that sounds absolutely crazy and completely and utterly bonkers, but of course, there are many drugs that are illegal, but used medically in the right doses might just have some positive effects. Well, joining me now to discuss this subject is Alex Pyatt, Director of Research at the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. Now, Alex, I'm not going to talk about decriminalisation or otherwise of cannabis or anything else, but what I really am interested in is the potential medical positive effects of LSD or indeed of magic mushrooms. I'm beginning to wonder, did Prince Harry have a point?
Well, perhaps he did. You know, the evidence is really pointing to these drugs being highly effective in difficult to treat mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety. And we can see these drugs starting to be rolled out in other G7 countries, such as Australia, which has rescheduled psilocybin, the active component in magic mushrooms, and MDMA, or Canada with their special access program.
Okay, so, I mean, we think of LSD, we think of magic mushrooms as people taking this stuff and absolutely, completely losing control of their senses, not knowing what they're doing, potentially not being responsible for their actions. And yet you're saying that there are potential medical applications that could genuinely help people with depression. But is the answer to that not like all the other drugs that are on the market for depression? They might make people feel better for a little bit in the short term, but does it actually deal with the condition?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, the evidence seems to indicate that with the use of these specific substances, you can really target the root of the problem. And with the help of a therapist and quite intense work, it is possible, it seems, from clinical trials to really have long-term benefits without repeated dosing. Now, in clinical trials, it takes only 2 doses and patients feel better for months afterwards.
Yeah, and the point that Sir Patrick Vallance is making here is that we haven't actually undertaken clinical trials on anything like a big enough scale to draw a conclusion. So what he's really saying is we need to actually do this properly to get a better assessment.
Yes, absolutely. The majority of trials that have been conducted so far have been on very small number of participants. What we need is large-scale trials with long-term follow-ups and more solid science in order to truly establish the efficacy of these medications. But for now, they seem extremely promising.
No, I mean, look, as I say, when I saw Patrick Valence's name attached to this, I thought, wow, this is potentially very, very interesting. One final thought, Alex, on all of this. You know, if we finish up effectively with LSD being given out on the NHS and the argument that it can be enormously helpful, isn't there a danger that a lot more people seek to buy it illegally and use it in ways that could be damaging? Could this not potentially be the legitimization of some of these mind-altering drugs?
Well, I feel as if it would be really important for the NHS to give access to these medications so that they can be used legitimately. Now, there's no evidence of diversion of Schedule II drugs into the black market for now. And the key point in these therapies is the therapeutic process that goes along with the administration of the drug.
OK, Alex, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Well, potentially, folks, very, very interesting to see where that clinical research goes. I remain deeply sceptical. Actually, I remain sceptical of virtually all drugs. I don't take any at all, thank goodness. I'm just convinced that we have a medical profession and a pharmaceutical industry who are busy giving us stuff that doesn't actually really make us better. Hey, maybe I'm completely and utterly wrong. It's just my view. Now, you hear much talk about the blob, the civil service, the enemy within, as some would call them. But the evidence continues to mount. You know, it turns out that the civil servant, you know, inside Number 10, that thought it was right that more of Boris Johnson's documents got handed over to the COVID inquiry, whether they be personal or not. But it turns out that Mr. Chisholm is actually a relation of Harriet Harman of the Labour Party and hadn't previously declared it. And that of itself may not be a crime in any way at all, but it does show how things work. And a story today that Home Office civil servants are threatening potential strike action over the government's Rwanda deportation policy and small boats legislation. So let's be clear. If a government with an elected majority actually at last tries to do something about illegal immigration across the English Channel and gets that through Parliament, it is not for the civil service to obstruct it. Their job is to carry out the will of the democratically elected government of this country. And frankly, not to do so, I think, is a complete and utter disgrace. And this needs the mass sacking of civil servants. If they won't do what they're told, if they think they're in charge, then we're way beyond laughing and joking, you know, at Yes Minister, which was always brilliantly written and very, very funny, but slightly worrying. This is open revolt from the blob against the elected government of our country. Mass sackings must begin, and begin soon. In a moment, I'll come back to that story about Labour, your pensions, what they want to do, and why I think it would be a complete and utter disaster.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I remember well in the mid-1990s, we used to pride ourselves that we had the best private sector pension provision of any country in the Western world. It was one of the great boasts of the country. And then Tony Blair got elected, Gordon Brown became the Chancellor, and they decided they would savage the private sector pension industry by putting a tax on dividends earned. And of course, what Gordon Brown didn't seem to understand, that it was actually the reinvestment of dividends into long-term pension savings plans. That was where the real growth in money over the years came, and he absolutely savaged it. Since that time, the pensions industry, which is a multi-trillion-pound industry, since that time, it's become hidebound by a number of EU rules, and many in the industry have been saying, come on, let's open this sector up, let's allow pension funds to invest in infrastructure and much else. But into all of this wades the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, this week. And she is saying that all of the pension providers should put 5% of the assets they have under their control and put it into a growth fund. Now, quite what would be in this growth fund, I mean, these clearly would be Rachel Reeves's tips for the top, businesses that she think we should invest in. Well, the lesson of this, of course, is clear. You can look at Scotland in particular, where, whatever it is, whether it's a tram scheme, whether it's a ferry across to the islands, they turn into complete and utter disasters. And whether this would be on a voluntary basis or whether there'd be compulsion, I just don't know. But it looks to me like, rather than opening up the rules for the pension funds and how they can invest their money, it's rather like a potential government diktat. One of the most outspoken voices on this has been PensionBee CEO Romi Savova, who said it looks like the party wants to tap money intended for retirements to support the economy. Well, joining me is Rebecca O'Connor, who is Director of Public Affairs at PensionBee. Rebecca, your boss, very outspoken on this. Does it feel to you that potentially a Labour government might be telling you what you have to do with other people's money?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It is other people's money, and because of that, we treat it very, very carefully. And we know that we want the UK to thrive. We want to invest in British businesses. All of that is great in theory for our pension funds, which are long-term investments. And so in theory, you know, they should provide the patient capital for these kind of projects. But of course, in practice, what happens with this kind of growth fund, you know, some of the investments go wrong. And the risk, as things stand with the kind of pensions that we have, falls on you as the individual. And of course, you know, your retirement income is not something that you particularly want to play with. It's valuable, and it's our money ultimately. So I think very good that we're looking at how pensions can help, but mandating, that's another thing entirely. And Rachel Reeves apparently didn't actually rule out mandating because she's relying on the goodwill of the pensions industry to do this. But of course, it all has to be in the interest of us savers at the end of the day. And at the moment, it's not very clear how that will pan out.
No, I mean, the argument will be from Labour, look, you know, we're just putting forward policy ideas at this moment in time. But I would guess that the historic relationship between the Labour Party and the private pension industry, after what Brown did by taxing the dividends back in '97, must be bad. When she talked about this, was this the first time you in the industry had heard of this idea?
No, it's been doing the rounds for some time, and indeed the Conservative Party has looked at it as an idea, and there has been talk of things like lifting the cap on investment charges to enable more investment in the kind of assets that would, you know, produce this kind of growth. So it has been talked about for a while, and Labour sort of pinning themselves to the mast, if you like, with this kind of, you know, pushing it a little further forward and saying we would push it further forward. But yes, I mean, it's flagging policy ideas at this stage. Yes, we do need to see the detail on it, and some transparency of where that money would actually go, because at the moment it's just very broad, isn't it? It's the whole of the UK economy. But what are the type of projects and what kind of returns could we expect from them? Because that's what we want as pension savers. We want to know that we're generating good returns for ourselves.
It must be very difficult for people. I mean, you know, clearly the pensions apartheid that exists between the public sector and the private sector is enormous. There must be, I'm thinking, Rebecca, a lot of people retired, about to retire, who think they've made adequate provision for their pensions, but find with the cost of living crisis, they're really struggling.
Yeah, so clearly inflation has put up the cost of living for everybody, but if you're facing living on a limited income, as pensioners are, it's an awful lot harder. And of course, if you're at retirement and you've seen the value of your pension fund decline 10, 15%, as some of them have in over 2022, then that's very scary too, because you've got less to play with, and so you've got to make that money last. You don't know how long you're going to live for. That's very, very stressful. So, you know, returns are hugely important to retirement outcomes. What we invest in, although we might not feel like we have much control over it because it's all done for us by workplace pension providers, is really important to our retirement outcomes. So, you know, this policy, hopefully it will lift the lid a little bit on what our pensions are actually invested in already, because it's actually mostly global equities, although, you know, some of that is, the proportion of that is reduced as people approach retirement to reduce the risk of people's values rising and falling. But, you know, we do need to know a little bit more about what we're investing in, because it does mean so much to us ultimately. And, you know, people don't retire on enough currently. The Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association gives us guidelines on what we need for retirement, and most people are coming out with something that gives them just above a basic living standard in retirement at the moment. We want that to be a moderate, at least for most people, and we're very, very far away from that at the moment.
Rebecca O'Connor from Pension Bee, thank you very much indeed for joining me. I've got time. I've got one quick barrage the Farage, and it's from Tristan in Pudsey near Leeds. Tristan, far away.
Hi Nigel, I'm Tristan. I'd like to ask you how you thought Brexit went. For me, it didn't go so well. And I was just wondering how you thought it went, because it looked like it was a bit of a mess, to be honest. So, love to hear your answer on that, Nige. Cheers.
Well, Tristan, obviously a well-known character in Pudsey as people are going past and pipping their horns. Look, you know what? When we look in the history books in 100 years' time, we will say it was one of the most significant constitutional changes that had happened for hundreds of years in our country. How it's been delivered, Tristan, is a very different matter. I've discussed that many, many times. I'm afraid I just don't believe the ruling Conservative Party actually believed in it. And there are so many areas, so many businesses where things need to be done, including, by the way, the last subject that I talked about, pensions. The pensions industry does not need the state to intervene more. It actually needs the state to get rid of a whole raft of EU directives tying them up. Let's free our businesses, be they pensions or fishing, and not tie them up. Now, I'm joined by Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, really interesting looking at what Labour are doing here. I mean, clearly the idea that pension funds should put 5% into some scheme that Rachel Reeves thinks is a good idea is unlikely to return good value for investors?
Extremely. And the point you're making about regulation is very important, that look at the issue with the LDIs in September.
This caused the crisis.
It caused the crisis and was because the regulator was telling pension funds they ought to buy gilts because they thought gilts were low risk when gilts were at their highest valuation in history. Regulators, governments, bureaucrats do not make good investment decisions. You want to leave it, this is my own profession, so I suppose I would say this, to people who actually understand markets. And whenever governments interfere in pensions, they make the returns worse. So people who are coming up to retirement or who've already retired will get lower returns.
No, I agree with you. But isn't it interesting that what we're seeing with Labour, and these are not firm manifesto pledges, but they're rolling out policy. They've done this on pensions. They've stuck to the idea that private school fees would incur a 20% VAT charge. And I wonder why they're doing all this. And Liam Halligan earlier, our rather excellent economics editor here at GB News, he says, I tell you what they're doing, Nigel. They're shutting up the left. They're throwing red meat to the left of their own party so they can present a united front at the election. Make sense?
Yes, but it's also how they govern. And the Labour Party realised, Tony Blair realised, that nationalisation didn't work and wasn't affordable. So don't nationalise, regulate. And if you use regulations, you have the same effects as nationalisation, but you don't actually have to pay for it.
Yes, I think that...
That's what they did 97 to 2010.
Yeah.
We haven't reversed anything like enough of it.
No.
And they will do it again if they get back into power. And so they control your pension fund by regulation. They will control private schools by regulation and just make it harder for people to get on with their own lives.
In a sentence, Tonight Show, Jacob?
No, Tonight Show, we're going to be talking about this outrageous civil service obstruction to Rwanda. That's not what civil servants are there for.
No, we need to start sacking them en masse.
If they don't deliver government policy,
they've got to go.
In my view, they resign, or they're fired.
Or they're fired.
They're not going on strike.
We need Jacob back sorting out the civil service rather than all these weaklings at the moment. But before all of that, let's get the all-important weather.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest weather forecast for GB News. High pressure keeps it settled, largely dry over the next few days, sunnier skies across the west, and then across eastern areas we just have a bit of a keen northeasterly breeze, which means it'll be a little bit chillier at times over the next few days, but really settled and dry going forward. For Tuesday evening, best of the late sunshine across western parts of the UK. Further east, it will generally be quite cloudy. The cloud thick enough, perhaps, for a few spots of light rain or drizzle. And just notice how that cloud pushes its way westwards as we move through the night. Temperatures not as cold as recent nights due to more cloud around, so temperatures holding up close to double figures. But it does mean a bit of a grey start to Wednesday morning. Best of the sunshine first thing, Northern Ireland, Western Scotland. And then as we go through the day, this cloud should slowly start to lift and break and push a little bit further back eastwards. But just notice how this stretch of cloud across the Midlands, South Wales into the West Country hangs on.